This week on London Real, we have Dennis McKenna, psychedelic researcher and brother of the legendary Terence McKenna.
They broke the mold when they made him.
Culture is not your friend.
Oh, the book was a very cathartic experience. It was not easy to write.
Where did human consciousness come from?
He has never really gone away. He's present on the YouTube. His talks are all over the place. And so he's become this kind of strange ghost. We discovered DMT in Berkeley, and not only was it the most amazing drug we'd encountered, it was the most amazing thing we'd encountered. This cannot be ignored. Ayahuasca's coming onto the world stage and saying, wake up, you monkeys.
London Real presents Dennis McKenna, The Screaming Abyss.
The world is not only queerer than you imagine, it's queerer than you can imagine.
If you've ever perturbed your consciousness in any way, and yes, you know what I'm talking about, then you will have heard the name McKenna. Probably Terence, perhaps Dennis, but these two brothers wrote the book on how to perturb consciousness through the use of mushrooms. And this is one of our plant allies. Others are ayahuasca and some of the substances derived from them, like dimethyltryptamine, DMT. And anyone who's listened to Terence McKenna speak, he's now dead, knows that this bard had a way of talking about culture, consciousness, information, language in a way that no man had since, and no man, in my opinion, ever will in the entire existence of humanity. And Terence didn't do it to sell something. He did it just to tell you how he was thinking. And I've had many amazing evenings listening to Terence McKenna. If you ever want to download his old audio lectures, the Psychedelic Salon is an amazing resource to do that. But him and Dennis were part of the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, which was a group of students from Berkeley who went down to Colombia in search of DMT a long time ago, and they came back with mushrooms, and they ended up writing a book about how to grow them, and are probably responsible for the widespread use of them, and probably responsible for you using them if you ever have in your life, because without these brothers really rediscovering them down in the Amazon, we might not have had access to them. So there's that, and then there's all the things that came since. Terence was a visionary. Dennis was a researcher. They both had kind of a dichotomy as far as roles, but they also were brothers, and brothers hate each other. They love each other. They fight. They make up. And these two were very close. And I went really deep with Dennis, and we spoke so intimately about his relationship with Terence, Terence's time wave theory, what he disagreed about it, Terence's brain tumor and how he died, how Terence actually stopped taking psychedelics before he died, and so many of the other issues and things they talked to each other about. And it was very special for me to sit down and have this time and pay homage to two brothers that have influenced me so much. When I go and have my time with Mother Ayahuasca, one of our plant allies in plant medicines, I always listen to Terence McKenna audio lectures in the wee hours of the morning, and they're just so profound, and they tell me so much about the experience I've just had that this was an episode I couldn't afford not to present to you and to the world. It was just an essential. So myself and the whole team at London Real, so proud to present to you Dennis McKenna and his story of growing up and working with and having the adventures with Terence McKenna. And so sit back, relax, and enjoy. If you don't know much about these two, then please do your research and find out. And if you do, then you'll be smiling the whole way. So now I leave you with Mr. Dennis McKenna.
The entrepreneurial journey, it can be a lonely road. I push myself in so many areas, but you can't do it all yourself.
thing about the academy is it's like, look, you have the ideas, you have the ability, you have the skill, and you have the sort of ambition for yourself. But when you have a group of people pulling you forward, it's so important.
Accountability is what's missing from most of the programs or any gurus or any internet mentor that I had before.
I wanted to get some accountability. I wanted to make myself accountable to a group, to you.
The reason we started the Academy is because I felt like we were doing these amazing talks, like we'd have a Peter Sage episode or a Dan Pena episode or a Kala or someone, and you get super inspired, and then YouTube stops, and then you go back to your life and you don't make any changes. And it was just like, what? It felt like, what are we doing? If you're designing your life right, the good times are now. And in a few years, you'll look back and say, wow, that was amazing.
The thing about the Academy is it has so many different sort of layers to it. I think your web seminars are awesome. The way you broke it down and the style of your teaching is pretty awesome.
I like the feed. When I have to motivate myself, I kind of look at others struggling and getting over those struggles. So I actually follow daily the feed.
Best feature would be the sort of Facebook aspect of it, the social media aspect of it, as in creating a profile with your goals, your dreams.
Everyone's on the same vibe, and we may be at different stages in our journeys, but everyone's on the same page at the end of the day. Everyone's really trying to push themselves and building the best you. It really resonates with me.
And the fact that I'm committing a small amount of money and the fact that I'm actually trying to interact with those people means that I'm invested and means that I will keep it for the long run.
You have to be serious about yourself and what you want to achieve. And if you're serious about yourself, this is going to be such a fantastic platform.
London Real, sponsored by Bulletproof. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dennis McKenna, who has studied psychedelics for over 40 years with his research focused on the interdisciplinary study of Amazonian ethnopharmacology and plant hallucinogens. You are the brother of well-known psychedelics proponent Terence McKenna and are a founding board member and the director of ethnopharmacology at the Hefner Research Institute. Your book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, chronicles your lifelong relationship with your older brother Terence. Dennis, it's a real honor. Welcome to London Real.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, the picture of the two of you on your book, of these two boys with these 50s haircuts, it just, I had to ask you about that. You know, you can see a picture of it there, and I'm
Yes.
sure you chose that one. You know, it makes me just want to ask, and first I want to say how you started the book with a passage. You said, reality is a hallucination concocted by our brains. Memory is a fragmented tapestry patched with confabulation. I was wondering, did you ever imagine that these two brothers with the 50s haircuts from an Irish family in Colorado were about to go on this incredible adventure?
No, never imagined it. Never imagined it. I mean, that passage, that thing I put in the book, is almost a disclaimer. You know, it's a way of wiggling out of what are undoubtedly there are inaccuracies in the book, because much of it depends on recollection. And as I was writing the book, I was appalled at some points in at the gaps in memory. But you remember what's important, what you feel is important. Whether you remember it accurately is another matter. But to the degree I could, I made it accurate. But that was my excuse to say, well, not everything in here is going to be absolutely correct. But to the extent that I could, I made it accurate. And I'm Irish, right? And so, as my brother was, and you are as well. So, so we Irishmen understand. Don't let facts stand in the way of a good story, right?
The gift of the gab.
Yeah. But to a certain degree, I tried to make my book accurate within my recollection. I found that I was regretting not keeping better notes at certain junctures of life, but at other junctures, I did keep good notes, and so that helped. But yeah, so...
Was this a book you always knew you were going to write at some point? Or was this something that you just kind of woke up one day and just decided it was about time to do it?
More like that. I didn't really think I was going to write this personal memoir, but it seemed that, after Terence died, it was very difficult for me when he died. I grieved very much and still do for him. We were so close, and it seemed like such a loss, and it was almost as though a deep part of me was just ripped out of me. So I was wounded, and it took me, that long to come to the conclusion that, well, as Terence was famous for being a good storyteller, I feel like I had a side to the story. I had an aspect of our shared experiences that I wanted to share with the world. And so it was a confluence of this desire to do that and the opportunity, but it was 10 years after Terence died that I really came to that conclusion. And at the time I thought, well, I have to get an agent and I have to find somebody that's interested in this story and so on. And I don't really know if I can do that, but I talked to Dan Levy, who was Terence's agent at the time, and I knew Dan pretty well, and I asked him, and he said, well, there's this new thing going, and this was 2011, and maybe 2010, I guess it was, end of 2010, this new thing called Kickstarter is going, and people are funding their own projects through this Kickstarter, and I said, well, gee, that sounds good. I'll look into that. And I did. And I decided to go for it, and do a Kickstarter campaign, because I figured that if anybody had an existing fan base that might support this kind of thing, certainly it would be Terence. And there's a community out there that really loves Terence, as I discovered. So I decided to put a Kickstarter campaign out there, and as it turned out, it was a right judgment, because I raised more money for a book than had ever been raised on Kickstarter before. So I raised $90,000, which, nobody was more amazed than I was. That gave me the resources to take time off and write the book, pay for its publishing, pay for some degree its advertisement. So I did it, and it was a good idea. It's turned out to be a mixed bag in some ways, because when you publish your own book, you don't have a publishing company behind you. You don't even have, I am the promoter, I'm the warehouse foreman, I do the shipping, I do it all, although I have a lot of it on Amazon. But all in all, I do not regret writing the book at all. It's opened a lot of doors for me, and I've been many interesting places as a result of having written it, I think, and it's been also personally very good. It's been a chance for me to really, in some ways, integrate and some of that grieving and some of what I had been feeling. The book was a very cathartic experience for me. It was not easy to write some passages of it. I have no regrets. I'm glad I wrote it.
I read a blog that you wrote when you were at your kitchen table when you got your funding, and you were like, "Uh-oh, now I have to write this thing."
Yeah, right.
And
that was the first reaction. Oh man, what have I done? Now I'm in deep trouble. I have to do it. But I got over that and managed to, over the 18 months or so it took to write it, I managed to get a good workflow going and finally settled down into it and, and wrote it. And it's been well received, in most quarters. And of course, after you finish and after it's actually in print, then I think every author thinks of different passages, different ways it could have been better, and only the author knows all the flaws in the book, of which there are many, but why, and not inaccuracies as such, just things I either left out that I meant to put in, or, but that's okay. I mean, may not be the only book I ever write. Hopefully it won't, right. But
it's beautifully written.
It is what it is.
It's beautiful to read, and it's very personal.
It is very personal.
I was curious, when you first started writing, were you thinking, okay, I'm just going to start out with the facts and then tell a few stories, or did you know right away that you needed to go in and get vulnerable about a lot of your emotions over the years?
I didn't want to just write a dry narrative. I knew that this was going to be a personal story, and that was part of the reason to write it, was, as I say, for my own kind of healing and emotional, integration of all these things. So I wanted it to be a personal story, and I sort of based on the feedback from the Kickstarter audience. Of course, many other people besides them have now bought it, but based on that, I felt that I'm not writing to a hostile audience. I'm writing to an audience that really cares about the Terry and Denny story, if you will, and understands, and they're not looking for, to pick it apart. And people haven't, and there's been plenty of opportunity to. Most of the response that I'm aware of has been really supportive, and as you say, congratulations and good for you for writing an honest tale. So I did. So I feel like it accomplished what I wanted it to. And
I was wondering, were you close with Terrence when he died in 2000, or had you kind of? I know you kind of gone your separate ways, kind of when you came back from Chorrera, and one kind of the Bard way, one the research way, and I want to hear more about that. But in 2000, were you close at that time?
Oh yes, we were close when he died. I mean, when he died, or when he got sick, we were never that far apart. We went our separate ways, but it wasn't really separate. We had lots of interaction, and we remained close for most of our life. But we'd gone through a period where we were somewhat at loggerheads about certain issues, and I think the last decade of Terrence's life was very difficult for him. I think he was conflicted in lots of ways about many things. His divorce and his career and, his investment in the time wave theory, which he was beginning to seriously doubt. And, he was suffering in some ways. And looking back on it, I'm actually kind of ashamed that I wasn't more supportive of him in some ways. I was maybe, honestly, I was maybe part of what was bugging him at the time, and I should have been more supportive during that period. But we were friendly, and I think he always knew. I mean, we were sort of getting through this, right? And I think he always knew that I loved him. I don't think there was ever any question about that. And even though we may have drifted apart and we had our little tiffs, you know, and that sort of thing, you know, but when he got sick, I just basically dropped everything and I was there for him, you know. And the day I heard he was sick, that he had this episode where he had these seizures on the Big Island, been airlifted to Honolulu and all that, that came to me like 24 hours after the event, and it came in the form of voicemail left on my office phone by Dan Levy, by this editor who was very close to him. He, you know, left this message and says, something's going on out there. I'm headed out to Hawaii, you know. And so when I got the message, immediately I called Dan and said, okay, I'm on the plane. I'm there. So I went out immediately. And, you know, Terrence was by then in the hospital in Honolulu, and pretty much I just put my whole life on hold for the next year, and it was just okay. I am there for you. Whatever needs to happen, I'm here for you. It was easy. It was difficult to do that, but career-wise, it was okay. It was easy to do that because I didn't have anything like a real job at the time. You know, I was a consultant working for different companies in the natural products world. That's what I'd done for the last few years. So I controlled my own schedule, you know, and I was just able to put all that aside, and that. So then my you know, my preoccupation for the next year was to, you know, whatever difference Terrence's I had at that time, just put all that aside, you know, and it was just, I'm there for my brother. And
what was it like that last year? Was he optimistic?
No, it was hard.
It was diagnosis pretty much. Yeah.
This diagnosis is a death sentence for most people. It's 98% mortality. It's the most virulent kind of brain cancer that there is. And when he got the diagnosis in Honolulu, you know, excellent neuro-oncologist and all that, but he knows, you know, I was there by then at the hospital, as well as Terrence's son and Dan and other people, other significant people. You know, but when the neuro-oncologist came to the hospital to discuss the diagnosis, he was very blunt. He just said, you know, my advice, we'll do everything we can, but, you know, my advice to you is, you know, put your affairs in order, which is a pretty telling thing. You don't want to hear that, you know, but he was honest, and he said, you know, and you know, he said, and he had operated on many people, worked with many people with this disease. The doctor had never had been able to save a single patient. And I told him, you know, you must be one of the most depressed physicians possible. Why do you keep doing this? He said, well, maybe one day, you know. And he was very, very good, very open to alternative therapies and all that. So we went into it with our eyes open, pretty much. That we knew, or we, Terrence and his loved ones, knew that the time was short. That being said, we decided to do, you know, as they say, everything we can. And my job, in a way, in that time became, at least as I saw it, and I think as Terrence saw it, is to be the kind of the expert, because I'm the only one with any background in medicine or pharmacology and all that. So So we went ahead with the treatments that the doctor recommended. They said it was not operable, that they couldn't get this tumor out without really damaging his brain. So the first thing they recommended was this thing called the gamma knife, which is basically you fire a high energy beam of gamma rays into the tumor and try to stun it and slow it down and maybe kill it even, or kill big parts of it. And that's good. That's the first thing you do. It's non-invasive, but it's a pretty radical treatment. So they did that, and then they followed up with radiation treatments with standard, and they did that, and it slowed it down for a while. But then, as time went on, it began to come back again, and that's pretty much what they said it would do. They checked him out, and they said, not only is it not working, it appears to be spreading now into his spinal cord and all that, which was a very unexpected result, because these central nervous system tumors, they rarely spread. This one was actually spreading. So at that point, it was like, that was the point at which the doctor said, there's nothing we can do.
Okay.
Threw up their hands and said, there's nothing we can do. And that was like mid-January, and he was in San Francisco, and he had some very close friends. This is where your real friends really come to the, step up to the plate, who said they would basically make their home in San Rafael available to him as a hospice site, and he went, and there he was until he died. And we tried all sorts of alternative therapy at that point. I mean, and had been all through, without really putting much faith that it would work. We tried a lot of different things, but the upshot was that none of it worked. He was really in a state of rapid decline, and he died on the 3rd of April. So he died about a month shy of a year of his diagnosis. So the gene therapy did really nothing to prolong his life.
What was the reaction to the community when he died?
To the community? Well, of course, the people were devastated. I mean, there was an outpouring of sympathy for everybody, for the family and everything. There was a group at the time called the Novelty Group, which was about, it was a discussion group about the time wave and all that. Beautiful people. They got together a CD called Journey Through the Spheres that was just put together and donated to the family, sold just to provide some money for the family and so on. It was, I don't think it ever sold a lot, but the gesture was nice, and just, what do you do in this situation? Yeah. It's just horrible. It's just, there's nothing good to be said about it. But I certainly, throughout all this whole process, I really was very moved by how many folk, people feel a personal involvement, I think, in our story and our adventure and so on. So when the chips are down, these people were there, and I really appreciate that, and I still do. And and that continues in some ways. That's why 10 years later, I can put up a Kickstarter and that fan base is still out there.
Is Terrence more famous now than he was in 2000?
He may be. It's interesting what's happened to him, which is that he has never really gone away. He's present on the YouTube and the internet, mostly YouTube. His talks are all over the place. Yeah. And so he's become this kind of strange ghost, that haunts the internet. And his thoughts and ideas are out there. And interestingly, they're as timely as they as ever as they were in the early 90s and mid 90s when he was articulating all this stuff. I have so many students. I teach at the University of Minnesota, so I interact with a lot of young people, 20-somethings. And they so often tell me, your brother was such an influence in my life. Everything I've learned from him. And it just surprises me because these people were in diapers when Terence was at the height of his career. They weren't even born yet. Yet somehow they discover him and they listen, and it really resonates with him, which is just a testimony to how timely and timeless his ideas were. The man was ahead of his time, no doubt about it.
I've listened to probably 100 of his lectures. I listen to him on iTunes on the Psychedelic Salon.
There you go.
And sometimes I have to remind myself that he's saying this stuff in 1992 and 91 and 93, pre-internet and so many things that have changed.
All those things, right,
and
right.
Yet so much of it is so relevant and so true.
It's a phenomenon for sure. And I think, I think Terence would be amused. I think he would be happy about that, because at a certain stage in what he was talking about how the internet was going to transform everything, and it is, as we've seen, it has. So yeah, I'm happy that his ideas are so alive still, and stimulating thought and all that. So, and in the 15 years since he's died, we've seen this whole psychedelic thing just explode, and the awareness of ayahuasca, the awareness that these stigmatized, condemned, prohibited, marginalized substances are suddenly almost respectable again, as the research accumulates and we begin to see, well, actually these do have great value in medicine and so on, potentially. So we're seeing that happen. Terence has got to have a lot of credit for that.
Both of you.
Well, both of us, yes. Okay, I'll take some credit.
Are you surprised when you look at it from 2000 to 2015, where we are today, when it comes to the awareness of plant medicines? Are you surprised how quickly that happened?
I am very surprised how quickly that happened. To Terence's credit, the neat thing, the good thing about Terence is that back in the day, in the 80s and the 90s, when it was not cool to talk about this stuff in public, he was talking about it.
Right.
He never stopped talking about it. And so it kept it on the table for conversation. So that then, and I was in it too, I was working in it, but I didn't want a lot of attention. I just wanted to do my science, and I was in the background of all this. And, but during the 90s, we started this Hefter Research Institute, which is, now thriving. I mean, at the time, people said, you're nuts. Even though we had very qualified people starting it, but people said, nobody's going to support this, you're crazy. Well, now Hefter's alive and well and thriving, and most of the leading scientists in research are either on the board or being supported by us or closely affiliated with us. I don't want to take away from MAPS. MAPS doing good work too, but we're sort of the nerdy ones in the background. We're smaller, we're less well funded, but we are now getting significant funding. And because as you ramp up these clinical trials, you need more and more funding. We just got a pledge for $750,000, from a donor that I can't mention, but that's encouraging. And just the way it's fallen out, not really deliberately, but the way it's sort of gone is that MAPS has kind of staked out MDMA for their they've hooked their wagon to MDMA, and they're focusing very much on treating PTSD using that compound, which is great.
MDMA through kind of a nice way in through firefighters and soldiers, which is a great way to sell it to the public.
And there's great need for this, so that's wonderful. And they want to make a prescription drug out of MDMA, and I do believe they'll probably succeed. And just we've sort of hung our hopes on psilocybin. Because that's the other one you could study in a clinical situation. It's very compatible with human metabolism. It's not toxic. You can use it in hospice situations, for example, and give it to people who are fairly ill, and it just is the perfect clinical psychedelic. And of course, it's not the same as MDMA. But so we're sort of working on psilocybin, and not that we're limited to that, but that's just the way it's worked out. And then ayahuasca sort of remains in the wings in some ways, because being a plant, it's more difficult to study under an FDA-approved protocol. And getting approval for psychedelic research is bad enough, but then one of them happens to be a plant.
You've got another fungus, so it makes it more.
Got another, well, psilocybin is synthetic. We work with the synthetic. It's a natural product, but it's synthetic. But ayahuasca is harder to. If you're going to study ayahuasca, you pretty much have to study the botanical preparation, because there are properties it has that any synthetic analog is not going to have, because it's 2 compounds at least and a whole bunch of other things. So ayahuasca is more difficult, but at Hefter, I become a big sort of advocate of, yes, we need to be looking into ayahuasca, and why do we have to play this silly FDA game? Let's just go to Peru and do this work. You can do good science in Peru, and ayahuasca is accepted. It's a national patrimony there. It's literally been declared to be a national patrimony. So let's do some of that work down there.
Right. And I want to talk about Peru, because you went down there for the first time in 1970, with Terence, is that right?
Well, we went to Colombia.
To Colombia, of course,
1971, right.
Okay. But before we get to that, I just wanted to say, you talk about like the 80s and 90s, how it was really rare for people to talk openly about these psychedelic experiences. And some of those recorded conversations where Terence is, people aren't using their real names. They don't want to be recorded, because for them it's dangerous, or they feel the danger to talk about then. And I guess this was kind of the Reagan say no to drugs time,
Right.
Our experiences on London Real were in 2012, we had a before and after ayahuasca episode, and I was hesitant because I thought I could never go back to banking. Now, this is 20, 25 years later, and I did a before and after DMT episode, and I'll be honest, Dennis, I was worried about my daughter and the parents and the principals and what they would think, and if a social worker would come, and we went ahead and did it anyways, and it was okay in the end, both of those times. But I can't imagine what it was like to talk about that stuff in the 80s and the 90s.
Well, yeah, it was, I mean, he was doing a lot of the talking. I wasn't doing much talking, and we were, but but I don't know. He was doing it because he was passionate about it and could not talk about it. That's what he had to talk about. That was his obsession. So he talked about it. And it turned out he was speaking to a certain audience where they felt like they couldn't, but they say, boy, I'm glad somebody's talking about this. Somebody's keeping it, the conversation open. And he did. And then we see, I don't know what's going on, Brian. There's something going on in terms of, a social and maybe even an evolutionary transformation around these plants, because the way that ayahuasca has literally exploded onto the world scene in about 10 years or so, is just mind-boggling to me. I mean, 10 years, 15 years ago, you walk up to the average person on the street and say ayahuasca, they won't know what you're talking about, or if they do, they probably think you're some nutcase and they'll be edging away from you. Now you talk to people about ayahuasca and chances are they know what it is and they associate it with a positive, has a positive association for them. And, I don't know. I mean, I verge on sounding like a bit of a fanatic. I guess I am, but I think that ayahuasca, like many of these psychedelics, indigenous people regard them as teachers. It's all about the plant teachers. And I think that ayahuasca has been marginalized in the rainforest for years, and the indigenous people sort of have been the stewards of that. But now it's getting a little concerned as we basically, our efforts to wreck the planet accelerate. Ayahuasca is coming onto the world stage and saying, wake up, you monkeys. The first thing you have to do is wake up and realize what's going on, and then change your behavior, your approach to it. And I think the main lesson of ayahuasca, and I would say for myself even more than Terence, ayahuasca has become my own personal teacher as well as my professional preoccupation. But ayahuasca is, many people are getting the message that, ayahuasca is giving us a message about our I guess I can't say that.
Yes, you can.
On a podcast. Our screwed up relationship with nature. And what we have to understand is, number one, that we're not separate from nature, which has been a misperception that's plagued Western society since at least the inception of Judeo-Christianity. And in fact, I think Judeo-Christianity is largely to blame for that. We have to understand that we're not part of nature, nor are we running nature. We're not in charge of this. The plants, if anything, are running nature, and they do, if you look at the dynamics of the biosphere. And I think, I think ayahuasca is trying to send us the message that we need to wake up. Many people are coming away from their sessions, especially if they go to South America, with this renewed commitment to, environmental issues. And the interesting thing is, you speak about, you were concerned about taking ayahuasca, with banker, because you were a banker and so on. Well, now, chances are, the guy sitting across from you is a banker in the ayahuasca session, or a CEO, or whatever. So I think that's very interesting, and that's important, because, people can go to Peru and drink ayahuasca. All kinds of people can do that. But what needs to happen is that influential people can have these experiences, because they're the ones that can implement real change. If they have these experiences and come back, they can make a difference. Not that all of the rest of us can make a difference, but you know what I mean. People in influential positions of power can really change things.
And that wasn't happening in
that's important.
And in the 70s, when you and Terence had this amazing discovery of the cubensis, and you came back, in the 70s, psychedelics were associated with the non-CEO types, right? It was this counterculture, it was dangerous, it was the anti-government movement, and
Absolutely.
LSD is still tainted by a lot of those society.
Yeah, it was definitely not mainstream at that time, and it's interesting that we went to La Chorrera. really with no idea what we were doing.
What were two boys doing in 1970 going down to Colombia? This wasn't exactly a tourism destination.
It was not a tourism destination. We did not know what the fuck we were doing. we were, all we knew was
you were 20,
that
right?
I was 20, Terrence was 24. All we knew was that we discovered DMT in Berkeley, in the Haight, in the Bay Area at that time. There was very little of DMT around.
Okay.
But Terrence had somehow manifested it out of the matrix.
So just a few of you were smoking
Just
DMT.
a few of us were smoking it.
Okay.
And we were all, at least our group, was convinced that not only was it the most amazing drug we'd encountered, it was the most amazing thing we'd encountered in our entire lives. And we thought, you can't ignore this. This is like, the discovery of atomic energy or something. This cannot be ignored. We've got to investigate this. And so we decided to go to South America because one of the, this is kind of the way, again, like I say, we're not running things, but we're playing a script out
Right.
in some ways.
The plants were bringing you down
The
there.
plants were bringing us
Right.
down there. We thought, well, DMT is totally amazing, totally transcendent, but it's so short in action when you smoke it that you can't bring much back from it other than the sense of astonishment and, oh my God, what was that?
Right.
And so we thought,
was LSD around in Berkeley at the time?
oh, LSD was right. LSD is what everybody else was
Okay,
taking.
but you and Terrence noticed a distinct difference between the LSD and the DMT. And you thought,
LSD was a drug. DMT was possibly a message from the future. We had no idea. We had no idea. It just seemed more almost like something masquerading as a psychedelic drug, something much weirder than that. We didn't know, but we thought, the thing is, we thought, well, if we go to South America, maybe we can find a form of DMT that will last longer so that we can actually take something back from it other than this, sense of astonishment. And so we went ostensibly to look for that.
okay.
At the time,
did you not respect LSD because it's synthetic? Is that something you always thought that's created by man and that's a drug?
No. We respected LSD.
Okay.
We respected. I respect it still. I mean, LSD is amazing molecule, a wonderful molecule. It was just that DMT seemed like another order of magnitude to it, and so we didn't know anything at that time, and little was known at that time that ayahuasca is in fact an orally activated form of DMT. The role of the admixture plants in ayahuasca wasn't really well understood. And of course, psilocybin is also an orally active form of DMT. If you think about it, possibly the best engineered form of orally active DMT. We didn't think in those terms. We ran across a paper by Schultes, R.E. Schultes, the famous ethnobotanist from Harvard, and the title of the paper was Virola as an orally active hallucinogen. That was the title of the paper. Harvard Botanical Museum leaflets. Well, we knew about Virola, which is a tree, the sap of which contains DMT and a lot of other tryptamines. It's used as a snuff widely in the Amazon basin by the Yanomami tribes and others. So that's fine. It's a snuff, and like DMT itself, the snuffs are short-acting. But this oral activity caught our attention, and it turned out that there was a few groups, notably the Witoto, that used it in an orally active form. And we thought, this is it. This is interesting. Now, let's go for that one. That sounded like the one to go for. So that's what led us to go to South America, to La Chirera. La Chirera only because it was the ancestral home of the Witoto. So that's where Schultes had made his collection. So we thought, well, we'll go there, and try and find this thing. So that's what led us to go to South America and La Chirera. We just gave up everything. I was in school at the time, and Terence was, at the time on the lam from Interpol, hiding out in Indonesia after this hash bust that had happened in 1969.
Okay, so he was running from Interpol because of a hash bust.
Yeah, well, he wasn't exactly running from them. They weren't even exactly looking for him, but he didn't want to risk coming back to the States. So he'd been in Indonesia for a while, and Tokyo teaching English for a while, and then ended up in Victoria, Canada for a while, but never could come back. And then, and our mother died in October of 1970. So it was kind of like, and he'd been in Victoria at that time. And so it was like, that was a major, transition for us. And also a shock in although we knew she was not going to last long, but it was kind of, she died in October 1970, and I think we both took it as a kind of signal that, okay, well, now we can go, we don't have to feel guilty about not being around for our mom. And so we did. We went down there, and we went to La Chorrera.
Just the two of you?
No, we had the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, right? At that time, we were formally constituted as the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss.
Who came up with that name?
Well, Terence, of course. And it was Terence and I and three of his associates from Berkeley, mostly. I mean, that was who it was. His girlfriend at the time, who he had met in Colombia, and she joined us, and then two of his friends from the Tussman program that Terence had been involved in at Berkeley. So that was kind of the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, which was really a really tongue-in-cheek name, obviously. That's the Irish part coming out, but we really, I mean, it was a humorous name, but we were also serious that, this is really an important thing that we're going after, but let's not lose our sense of humor about it, right? And so we went down there, and have you read the book?
Yeah, I've read a lot of passages.
A lot of it.
Yeah, a lot of it.
And we went to La Chorrera, expecting to find this Witoto drug, which was called ukuhe in Witoto, this preparation. And when we finally got to La Chorrera, or on the way into La Chorrera, we met this anthropologist who we knew was going to be in the adjacent village, or the village on the way in, because we checked for him in Bogota, and it was like, he's out with his people, right? So you find Dr. Guzman, was the name Terence used in the book, at El Encanto. So we went to El Encanto first, and we found him, and he was utterly appalled that we'd showed up. And, because we were not, we looked like we stepped right out of Haight-Ashbury. I mean, we were far more colorful than the Witoto people, and beards down to here, and bells and beads, and, just madness, We were a colorful bunch. So that appalled him. And then when we got there and started talking about a kuhe, that we'd come to find ukuhe, we was extremely upset, because how did you find out about that? How do you even know the name of this thing? And it was, Schultes published a paper on it. So here we are, Doc, show us the way. And
this is pre-internet, so probably only a few hundred people in the world would have read that paper.
Right. And Guzman had been one of the informants that talked to Schultes. And I said, well, yeah, we know. So as he said, well, you can't walk in there and start talking about ukuhe, because they'll kill you. This is a big secret even the shamans know about it. Even the rest of the Witoto people, they don't know about this. You can't go in there. Well, as it turned out, he was being a little bit, paranoid himself and a little bit protective. But we said, okay, so there may be some issues around this. Fine, Doc, we'll be cool. No worries. We're not going to breach any protocols here. But we said, well, continue on to La Chorrera, and which involved going over this overland shortcut from one river to another, which took 4 days and was quite an ordeal. And but we did that. We arrived at La Chorrera.
And how were your spirits at the time? Did you ever turn to Terrence and be like, what are we doing? We got to go home? Or was it just this mighty adventure and everyone was in?
That's pretty much everyone was in. We were obsessed. At times there were moments when we wished it was not so rough and maybe a little more comfortable and all that, but we knew we were on a quest. We were looking for the secret, and formally called it the secret, not even knowing what it was, thinking it was this drug, right? Well, so we got to La Chorrera, and we were true to our word, to Dr. Guzman. We didn't immediately start talking about it. Well, we found at La Chorrera it was a mission village, a Capuchin mission, and the pasture had been cleared around the mission for a couple 100 acres, I guess, of pasture. So it wasn't in the forest. The forest surrounded it. But in the pasture, they'd put in these Cebu cattle, which are the preferred substrate. The dung of the cattle is what Stropharia or Psilocybe cubensis grows on, at the time called Stropharia cubensis. So we got to La Chorrera, and we settled in. We were welcome there, only because they could give us a house that was well away from all the decent people, and we settled in, and we knew what these mushrooms were because we'd encountered them a couple times on the way in, and we'd also done our homework, we had references on them, so on. Okay. So we thought.
Had you had mushrooms at Berkeley before?
No, there was no such thing like that in Berkeley. There was no psilocybin, no real psilocybin at the time in Berkeley, but we had encountered them a couple of times, once in Florencia and once in Porto Leguizamo on our way in. But there weren't much, so we'd had like 1 or 2 carpophores, 1 or 2 mushrooms, and had a light dose, which a light dose is a light dose, and it's quite enjoyable, it's quite giggly, it's no big deal,
Because let's talk about
so we got, just to complete it, so we got to La Chorrera, and these carpophores, these mushrooms, big clusters, are growing out of practically every cow pie.
Right. So we thought, on the bottom, at the top of them, they grow out.
Well, they grow out of the top.
Right.
They grow cow pie and they grow out of the top. And we thought, wow, this is great. This will be fun. We can have fun with these while we wait for the ukuhe to manifest, and after we find, while we're waiting for the real mystery. And, as you heard the other night, and as I explained in the book, we were so clueless that today it boggles my mind. But we started eating these mushrooms purely as a recreational thing. And pretty soon it became clear that, in some ways that was the real mystery. Because it started, downloading, a lot of funny ideas to us, what Terrence liked to call funny ideas. And,
how many mushrooms were you consuming at the time?
Well, we were consuming a lot and pretty regularly, not so much in quantity, so much all the time, but we kind of incorporated them into our diet because we didn't have a lot to eat. We didn't bring enough food, and so we would kind of put them into the rice or the the omelet or whatever. We didn't have a great deal of food, and they taste not bad, in the fresh form. So we were eating them quite regularly.
Okay.
And they were stimulating a great deal of conversation and speculation and funny ideas and all that we we came up with this idea for what turned out to be the experiment at La Chorrera, which was the protocol for the experiment, if you want to put it that way, was downloaded to us by the mushroom, which presented itself pretty much as an intelligent entity of some kind, not necessarily the mushroom, but maybe something was communicating to us through the mushroom, that was telepathic and that was suggesting all these ideas for an experiment that we could do that would do something. And and so we were more or less taking our marching orders from that source and not really questioning it. And it's hard to talk about it. It's hard to explain the state we were in at the time, which is why I rarely discuss this in public, the details of the experiment at La Chorrera, because it's hard to explain. I just say, read the book. It's all there. It's all dissected in the book. But anyway, the mushroom came up with a lot of funny ideas that we thought we could actually kind of act on and do this biophysical experiment involving singing to mushrooms and singing to our own DNA and using sound to create some kind of a material that was, partly mind and partly matter. And that would, be in some ways the ultimate artifact in a certain way. And, so even at this time, it's strange to try and explain all this.
Right. In the book, you said, the experiment at La Chorrera, you later wrote, was building a hyperdimensional vehicle out of the 4D transformation of my own DNA interlaced with the DNA of a mushroom. That probably doesn't even begin to explain it very well.
Yeah, well, that was the basic idea.
Okay,
That's
and you
what
conducted
it was.
these experiments while you were there.
We did the experiments while we were there.
Right.
The mushroom egging us on to do these experiments.
Over the course of days and days, or weeks and weeks?
Yeah, over the course of days and days, these ideas took form, and then we actually performed the experiment one night, March 4th, 1971, and what we had predicted would happen did not happen, because it could not happen. It would have violated all kinds of physical laws. Well, at that point, we didn't have any use for physical laws. We totally expected that, but the universe had different ideas. It did not happen. But we had painted ourselves into a epistemological corner in some ways, so that what we had predicted did not happen, but something had to happen, because we had convinced ourselves that we were getting feedback from the future moment of this performance of the experiment, that confirmed that up in the future, a few hours in the future, we'd performed the experiment and it had succeeded. So we knew before we did it that it was going to work. And then when we did it, it didn't work, but something else happened. And what happened was that we went on this, I guess we got, I mean, it depends on if you're looking at it from the inside or the outside. We went on a shared experience in which I basically became psychotic for 2 weeks and was cruising hyperspace, and Terence became psychotic in a complementary way, in which he was completely focused on this reality and kind of being an anchor for me. And and it was like our companions by that time were not in this loop, and some of them were quite appalled at what was happening and thought, this is really spiraling out of control, and we need to get these two crazy people back into some kind of psychiatric intervention. And we were saying, no, it's fine. We perfectly understand each other, and this is how it's supposed to unfold, so relax. And fortunately that's what happened, because there was no way we could get to a hospital. We were in the middle of the jungle, so the process was able to play itself out.
And were you consuming mushrooms for this entire time, for the 2 weeks?
No, we're done with that. We were finished with that. We weren't continuing to eat mushrooms, but whatever biochemical processes we triggered continued. Okay. And it took about 2 weeks for everything to settle down and get back to normal, or more or less to baseline. I don't know that they ever got back to normal. They may still not be back to normal. But the thing is, so...
Did you record all of this at the time, like written down?
Oh, yeah, we were writing furiously,
And the rest of the Brotherhood was doubting you, taking their own notes, trying to talk you out of this, trying to get you to leave?
They weren't so much taking their own notes. They were certainly doubting us. I mean, they were definitely alarmed, by what was happening, and like, these guys are just out of control, but we were like, just chill, we were just saying, everything's fine. This is unfolding exactly as it needs to. And Terrence and I, were comfortable in this conceptual structure that we'd created, in this theoretical structure. We had a framework for what was going on, which was based partly on alchemy. We were both into alchemy, and we viewed this as an alchemical process. And the idea was to condense this thing, whatever it was, this mind-matter amalgam, which we call translinguistic matter, in a form that was visible. So it would be a visible artifact that we'd created out of mushrooms and sound and our own DNA, that we could actually, you could see it and be it at the same time. And it would be like, in that sense, it would be the ultimate artifact, because it would do anything your imagination told it to do. Okay. And, so crazy stuff, right?
But you weren't able to create that artifact.
We were not able to create, no, we wouldn't even be here if that had been the case.
But the experience of trying to do that brought you to another level.
Drove us both crazy. Right.
Now that's while you were there. Now, how did you know it was when to leave? And was that like a pivotal moment in your life, and the time where you and Terrence were kind of woven together?
Oh, yeah, I'd say so. I mean, I've wrote in the book, and I think it's true. I think that, our lives were defined really by, pre-Lotcher era and post-Lotcher era. And we've, and most of our lives were lived post-Lotcher era. This happened early on. We were young, so, we've lived in the shadow of that experience ever since, or the light of that experience. It was pivotal, definitely. It was important for us personally. I don't regret it for a minute. I feel like, for me, personally, I was the one that got to go. I was the one that was cruising hyperspace for 2 weeks. Terrence was focused very much in this world, trying to, for one thing, be a beacon for me, watch over his little brother, I think with a certain degree of guilt associated with that, because it was all about, well, you know, you've been trying to drive your little brother crazy for as long as we've been together. You finally succeeded, right? So are you happy now? You know, I could hear my mother saying this. And so,
Because he used to tickle you, and he used
he
to...
tormented me constantly when we were younger, sure, like siblings will do. And so...
But he took care of you at La Chorrera.
He took care of me at La Chorrera in a really loving way, because he felt that he was the only one that could understand what I was going through, what he was going through. At the same time, he was trying to figure out the mechanics of this condensation process of this alchemist stone, or whatever the thing was that we were trying to make. And so a lot of his since it did not appear instantly when we did the experiment in a cloud of, you know, crystals as it dropped into superconductivity, and all that didn't happen. So, but part of the exercise was to figure out, well, okay, we've succeeded, we think. When will it condense? When will it actually manifest? And a lot of what Terence was doing at the time was trying to work out cycles and figure out, when is the thing going to manifest. And that was the genesis, really, of the time wave theory.
Okay, interesting.
You know, I mean, the crude cycles that he was talking about, and then he got onto the I Ching. And in some ways, you could say, you know, we came back from La Chorrera. I had this acute experience. When it was over, I was pretty much back to baseline, and I was pretty much done at the time. I'm like, look, I just want to go home. I want to get back into school. I want to keep my feet on the ground. This is more than I bargained for.
No more taking psilocybin. No more smoking DMT. You were done for a while.
Well, for a while, I said, you know, I want to get back into normal reality. And in some ways, Terence never recovered in a certain way, or it took years, because he came back from it convinced that, in some sense, we had succeeded, and that the only mistake we'd made was predicting when it was going to happen. So he came back with this idea about the time wave.
Right.
And the time wave became more and more elaborate as he did. And he came back to Berkeley. I went home sooner. I went back to Boulder, but then a few minutes later he came back to Berkeley, and I went out there. And he came back, you know, with Ev, with his girlfriend, who stuck with him throughout all this, and you know, and talking to his friends. And it's like, well, you know, we've succeeded, and pretty soon it will be apparent that we've succeeded. And they're like, no, you know, you're just nuts. You know, not getting a lot of support from these people, and you know, and so he, over the years, elaborated this time wave, and in some ways, the you know, the idea of the eschaton that he came up with, and this collapse of the space-time continuum, was really what was supposed to happen at La Chorrera, and it didn't. So the question is, when is it going to happen? And the prediction for when it was going to happen got pushed further and further back until it was comfortably in the future, namely December 21st, 2012, which was the date he'd settled on for a whole bunch of reasons, and not just because it was the Mayan calendar, you know, end, but that certainly didn't hurt. I mean, the fact that that synchronicity was recognized was, to his mind, a further validation of it. Well, by that time, you know, and I was always a skeptic about the time wave. I never bought into the time wave. I couldn't, I mean, I had an open mind, but as time went on, it became clear that the time wave was, you know, it was a beautiful mathematical idea. And he had figured out a way to use the I Ching as a calendar. And I think that in itself was a kind of an interesting discovery. And had he been a sinologist and a scholar of the I Ching and come forth with this, people would have had to say, well, that's something about the I Ching we've never thought of before. It's a calendar and you can use it this way. But he wasn't satisfied. And, that would have been recognized and he would have gotten praised for that. But he wasn't satisfied with that. I mean, the I Ching was, this time wave was nothing less than something that described the structure of time for him, and that could predict the end of time. And so it got fairly obsessional. And
it was frustrating, you said, him in the 90s, but, before he got his diagnosis. You're saying that it was upsetting him, the time wave, and him trying to get his head around it, or
it was upsetting him because he was beginning, I think, to have a lot of doubts about it at the time, and I had been critical of it, and and that was part of his resentment against me because I was not buying it, and then other people piled on, and there was a episode at one of the Botanical Preservation Corps meetings where there was this mathematician who showed up, whose name was Watkins, and he was not a particularly pleasant person, but he was a real smart person, and he understood the time wave and the mathematics behind it probably better than Terence did. And he came to I think it was 92 or somewhere around about then, and stood up and said, well, this is wrong. There's a mistake in the time wave, and here's the mistake. And he was able to say what the mistake was. He wasn't dismissing it completely. He just said, you made a mistake in the construction of it. Here's what you should have done, right? And Terence was, what? Couldn't deal with that. That was very upsetting to him. And I think it fed on his existing doubts, and it really, along with a lot of other things that were going on at that time, including his divorce and all this, it really put him into a funk after that. And he had a lot of doubts. And I think that was the start of a decade that was hard for him.
But Terence was known for being very anti-dogmatic. He was known for kind of throwing theories out, and sometimes in half joking, and sometimes just to see if people would test him. So it's always strange that he was so invested in this theory.
Yeah, I mean, but it was his pride and joy. It was his baby. A few things. He was very invested in it. He was talking about it a lot. It was paying the bills, along with all the other shtick that he was doing. But this was a big part of paying the bills. He really wanted to believe it too. He wanted to believe it, and that combination of things made it hard to give it up.
Right. You didn't like his shtick sometimes, right? I thought I remember hearing you say one time on a program, maybe it was the Rogan first one, where you were like, Terence, you're just talking nonsense. All you do is get people so high and talk all this nonsense. Was that accurate of how you felt about his shtick in the 80s and 90s?
It's not that I liked his shtick. It's not that I disliked his shtick. I was, but he didn't like me in a way to come to a lot of his talks at Esalen and other places. He didn't like me because I was the only one that would ever stand up and object or say, things like, well, you just said this. It didn't make any sense. It directly contradicts what you said 20 minutes ago. That didn't make any sense. So this is nonsense. These are beautiful words, but they don't mean anything. And he would say, well, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, and just sail on, but it was more, I mean, people did look at him, and his words were so beautiful and so articulate that he could say the craziest things and it seemed to make sense. And people were just slack-jawed. No one would ever object, or, you know, I mean, occasionally objections would come up and later, but no one would ever really get up and say, you know, we have some conceptual, you know, problems here. And I would say those things, and he didn't like that. And I mean, and we talk about it privately, and we was much more receptive, but he didn't like to be challenged in public so much. And
why was he so revered? Why would people just listen and not challenge him?
Because I don't know. I really don't know. I think part of it is it's almost like his speaking was hypnotic in some way. He would put people into this state of receptivity. And then I realized it's not about what he's saying, it's about the way he's saying it. He was a poet. He was a shaman, a true shaman, though he never would have thought of himself that, but he was a poet in the way that he articulated things. And I used to say, look, you could get up there and read the phone book and people would be absolutely fascinated, because it's the voice. It's the voice of Terence. That's what it was. You know, and even like later on, like later on in the latter 90s, you know, he was talking about glossolalia a lot and stuff like that, and how the mushrooms cause glossolalia, and he would actually give lectures where he would imitate this glossolalia for a long time and speak this gibberish. You know, and people would be fascinated because of the rhythm and the flow and the way it works. And I told him, well, at least you admit now that you're talking nonsense.
I haven't heard those tapes.
You haven't heard those?
I haven't heard
yeah.
those, yeah.
Well, he did that. So, you know, so...
and was he always like that as a boy, or did he develop that over time?
What, of the gift of gab?
Yeah, gab and the poetic way of speaking. Is that something he worked on, or does that?
Well, I think it was. I think being Irish, I think he had a real feel for the rhythm and the tone of language. I don't know if as a boy, but certainly as a young student, like in high school and college, that's exactly what he did. His work was, you know, he was practicing for this career of being a bard or being a poet and a shaman in a sense, not in any conscious sense. But, you know, in Berkeley, he was, you know, he lived in this big hippie house on Telegraph Avenue with a bunch of other crazy people. This was 67, 68, 69, utter madness reigns, you know, and he liked nothing better than to get a bunch of people stuffed into his bedroom, and he would get them so loaded on hash that nobody could speak or move or anything, you know, and then they just sit there because they couldn't move, they couldn't say anything, and it had the opposite effect on him. And he would just rap it out for hours, and he'd go on and on.
And you would listen to him as well?
I listened to him as well,
too,
sure,
okay.
Sure. And I loved listening to him, you know, and still do. I mean, I don't listen to his YouTube tapes and so on all the time like some people do, but I do listen occasionally. He had this amazing ability to suggest, to say just the craziest things in a way that made it seem quite rational, and that certainly people would not, you know, they wouldn't think that, you know, this is just a crazy person raving. He could make it sound really plausible.
Every time I listen to him, I always wonder, where is the modern day equivalent of Terence? And would they exist? Because when Terence was saying these things, it's like he's not selling something, and there's no podcast, and there's no this, and back then there are views that most people wouldn't even stand up and talk about. But there's never been anything like him.
There's never been anything like him.
Will there ever be?
Unless maybe some of the, you know, some of the inspired prophets of religions and so on, who had that same ability to just download the maddest things, and yet they had this incredible charisma and ability to deliver stuff, and so people took it seriously. But what's cool about Terence in that respect, and what's interesting about him, and you know, for which I admire him very much, was, you know, that he had this rap, but he was not a guru. He never thought of himself as a guru. He didn't ask people to believe. He didn't ask much of anybody, other than think for yourself. You know, here's a bunch of interesting ideas. I think they're cool. Take that, do with them what you will, you know, but don't believe me. You know, I'm not here to create a following. I'm just here to put these ideas out. And he was you know, ethically right on in that respect, because, you know, you get in a situation like that where you are a spokesman, you are articulating thoughts that a lot of people wish they could say. So there's a, you know, for every person like that, there are 100 people that want to follow them. Yeah. And that's the problem with you know, with gurus and with faith and with religion in general. You know, I mean, the religious leaders are too often ready to say, yes, come follow me. You can stop thinking now. Right. We'll tell you what to think from here on out. Just, you know, accept that, and it'll all be comfortable, and you'll be good, you know. And Terence wouldn't accept that role.
Yeah, he was never selling anything, and that's, I think, you picked
least
that up.
of all himself.
Yeah,
right.
And you pick that up in the first few minutes of any one of his talks. You just feel like the tone of his voice is that he's not selling anything. He's not selling himself. If anything, he says, don't trust anything you've heard. Trust the psychedelic experience more than anything.
Exactly.
Because that's the direct message.
Right. That's what he would say.
Right.
And that was the correct thing to say. So I admire him for that. You know, he never really got into it. And another thing,
he could have had thousands and thousands of followers. He could have had Rolls Royces. I mean, he had that much charisma.
He could have had all those things. But then I think he would have felt that he was a false prophet, and he would have been right. I mean, he didn't want to be a prophet. He was very much invested in the idea that people have their own minds and their brains, and they can use their own analytical capabilities to, you know, evaluate these things, and that's what he encouraged. So that's great. And the other aspect is, you know, I mean, I think he believed in what he was saying, but he never took it too seriously. You know, there was always room for humor and that sort of Irish twinkle that he brought to it. And that was great, you know, because, you know, you don't see that much in these situations. I mean, the gurus, the prophets, the people that say, anybody that tells you that they know what they're talking about and they have the answer and all that, number one, they don't. You know, the very fact that they can say that is a red flag to run the other direction. And the other thing is they lose their sense of humor. You know, it's like, oh, this is serious stuff. We all have to be serious. And no, we don't.
And even about his time wave, he wasn't that serious, or that was the one thing he was a little serious about?
He was a little serious about it. He even got less serious about that in time.
As time went on.
Yeah, but he, yeah, I mean, and that's, he was not ever, you know, so serious or so humorless about any of it as to become tiresome. And that's the thing. It's very easy to become tiresome, you know, in this thing. And so in that sense, I hope I've lived up to him, you know, because, I mean, I don't take it, I take everything seriously, and yet I take nothing seriously. You know, and my sort of operating, you know, my sort of perception really is that nobody knows what is going on. There's lots of stuff going on that we don't understand. Now that's a reason to be depressed in some ways, but for me, it's a reason to be happy because it means that there's so much more that we have to learn, and the world is much more marvelous than we can imagine. Terence was very fond of JBS Haldane's quote, which is, "The world is not only queerer than you imagine, it's queerer than you can imagine." And he was using, the word queer in a way we don't use it anymore, but just weirder, stranger, more miraculous, more interesting than we can possibly imagine. And that actually is reason to be optimistic and hopeful in my mind. But then also, I think humble, to realize that we probably never really will have a clear picture of everything that's going on, but that's no reason not to just give up. Let's continue to try to understand it and make sense of it, and we'll learn more. And ayahuasca, again, ayahuasca is a good teacher, and it's a good teacher for many people. And partly because, for me, people say, well, you've been taking ayahuasca for 30, 40 years, what have you learned? What I've learned is that I don't know shit, and ayahuasca always reminds me of that when I take it. Remember how little you know. So don't get a big head about this, you're just a curious monkey after all. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. I think for myself and everyone, that's really all we are. We're curious monkeys. Or some of us have lost our curiosity, and that's a shame. Mm. That's what keeps it interesting to me,
How often do you have ayahuasca ceremonies?
About as often as I can.
Okay. Monthly?
Huh?
Monthly? Quarterly?
No, it's not a regular cycle like that. The way it's worked for me in the last few years is I tend to do mostly ayahuasca in South America. So I've been working off and on in South America ever since I did my graduate work. I went down to Iquitos in 1981 to do my graduate work, and I've kept that connection ever since and gone down regularly. Lately, I've been organizing ayahuasca retreats in the Sacred Valley. So the way it works is I go there once or twice a year and I do a retreat, and we do ayahuasca several times, and then might be 6 months or more before I do it again. I do them in the States, but not on a regular basis.
Is it not the same?
It's the same.
Okay, so you don't have to be in the jungle.
You don't have to be in the jungle. No, not at all.
Is there a statue in Iquitos of the McKenna brothers because you created the ayahuasca tourism business in Iquitos?
No.
But it probably wouldn't exist in its form if it weren't.
There is no statue, thank God. Nor is there a statue in Paonia, Colorado, too, although somebody contacted me recently and suggested that. And I said,
what's in Paonia? Oh, where you're from?
There. Yeah, the town where we grew up.
But
don't go there. We don't need no friggin' statue.
But the popularity of ayahuasca can be very much attributed to you brothers, right?
In part, yeah, I think so. In part, and mushrooms as well. Right. I mean, we, that was what I was going to say several stages back in this conversation. One of the things that we were at La Trera that we were very invested in a way at bringing back. We wanted to create this technological artifact that would, mark the end of history and all that, and would be really disruptive, really essentially seriously disruptive. We didn't do that, but what we did bring back over time was we brought back spores of psilocybe, and we figured out how to grow them And we were the publishers of one of the first books, if not the first book, on growing the psilocybin mushrooms. So we published Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide in 1975, 5, I think it was, 1975. And that was a simple technology that gave everyone with a modicum of skill about the level of a 7th grade science project, where, in a spare closet, the ability to grow these mushrooms. Right. And at the time, there were economic benefits of that. There was a mercenary, element to it, but that wasn't our real motive for growing mushrooms. The fact that you could sell them, that was obvious. But our motive for growing the mushrooms was that we wanted confirmation of these places that we'd been accessing. And we thought, if we get this out, other people will go to these dimensions and experience it, and either they'll see what we're seeing or they won't. But we'll have some, we'll spread it out, and see, let the world in and let them decide. And it turns out what we were seeing and the thoughts we were having and all that, not so crazy. Right. At least if they were crazy, many people experienced the same delusion. So we brought
was like
the
a
mushrooms.
Virus that you put out into
it was
the world.
Like a virus.
Right.
And so the mushrooms, I'm proud of that. In some ways, we couldn't cop to it. We published it under pseudonyms at the time. But in terms of having an impact on society, I think it was huge. And it kept it on the table, and over time it had this effect, because a lot of people grew mushrooms, and mushrooms became something that everybody who wanted psychedelics, they could get a hold of them pretty easy. So then a few years on up, when our focus kind of shifted to ayahuasca, I was bringing plants back from Peru and getting them into Hawaii and all that. And we were probably the first ones to bring ayahuasca into Hawaii, and now Hawaii is an epicenter for its spread around the world. We had no agenda here. We had no idea this was going to happen. It was just the way it happened. But I think that one of the things that really affected kind of ayahuasca's, coming into the world's attention was in 1991, I think. Luis Eduardo Luna, who was a longtime friend of Terence and mine, he was present, from the beginning. He was one of the people that Terence encountered on his way back from his second trip to La Chirera. Then I met Eduardo 10 years later. And we became close friends, and we worked in South America together. And I introduced Eduardo in 1985 to Pablo Amaringo, who is the visionary painter of ayahuasca visions. And in fact, it was on this visit of Eduardo and mine, when I introduced him to Eduardo, that the idea of doing visionary paintings came up. He'd never thought to paint visionary paintings before Eduardo and I suggested it. I'd met him in '81 before, on my way out after my graduate work, and we had a nice conversation. He showed me some of his paintings, which were realistic and totally boring, not particularly interesting. Then we went back in '85. I introduced Eduardo to him, and Eduardo, of course, speaks perfect Spanish, which I did not. And the idea came up, well, have you ever thought about painting these visions? Because it came out in our conversation that he had been an ayahuasquero, Pablo Amaringo, which I didn't know in '81. It came out in the conversation, and Eduardo suggested, have you ever, and he said, well, yeah, I used to be, and I stopped because I got into battles with different shamans, different brujos, and it was clear that one of us was going to die if I didn't step out of this world of sorcery and witchcraft. So I just stepped out, but he said, I remember my experiences, and Eduardo suggested, why don't you try and paint one or two and see how that works out? And so that started him painting these things, which was kind of triggered this outpouring of creativity, which went on for years. And then eventually he and Eduardo published this book called Ayahuasca Visions, the religious iconography of a Peruvian shaman. And the book was a beautiful coffee table book with these paintings, right? And on the opposite page in English was this detailed description of every element in the painting and what the plants were, the animals were, the spirits, what all that meant in terms of the cosmology of what we understand as vegetalismo. That was the tradition. It's not that he just made up these images. These came out of a certain symbol set, a certain cosmological world that he inhabited. But then that book got into a lot of people's hands, and
Another virus.
Again, the virus thing, and I think that was what really brought ayahuasca to the attention of a lot of people.
Okay.
This book, and then that spread out, and that really started phase 2, if you will, of the ayahuasca tourism phenomenon that made people aware of it. And
do you think that the introduction of psilocybin in the way that you did with the, not the cookbook, I guess that's the wrong way to say it, the Grower's Guide, do you think that kind of facilitated the second wave of ayahuasca? People that were already open to
definitely. I think it was the second wave, if you will. It was a two-way thing. And and this is where you begin. Sometimes I say, I'm not doing this, I just work for the plants, right? And so in that sense, you could say, well, the plants are doing this. This is part of the co-evolutionary, sort of pact we've made with them or something. I really am not, I don't have a agenda for world domination in most cases, usually. It's just the way it's been, it's just how it's worked. And and so I'm just doing what I'm doing, but I think of myself as working for the plants, and that's kind of a reasonable model, I guess. I mean, at least I'm not controlling this. Right. Now it's taken on a life of its own.
Terence used to say that about growing mushrooms. He said that once you've learned how to grow a mushroom, it is only by that time that you're ready to take one. And he said something about the patience it takes to cultivate one, or the knowledge or the connection you make, and then that gives you kind of the right to consume them. Did you believe that?
No. No. I mean, I think it's good. I think ideally, yes. You grow your mushrooms, and you by the act of growing them, it's all about symbiosis, right? Symbiosis is what these plants are pushing. That's what ayahuasca wants, that's what mushrooms want, that's what really any plant that we might domesticate and find useful. If you're familiar with the work of Michael Pollan, he's very good at articulating this. He used to be the food writer for the New York Times. And now he's interested in psychedelics, and actually he's got a book in the works on that. But he would talk about, he wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma and The Botany of Desire and a few things like that. And he makes the point about how domesticated plants like corn, for example, are we domesticating corn, or is corn domesticating us? And I think that's true of these psychedelic plants as well. They have an agenda, which is basically, as I said, trying to get us to wake up before we blow up the place. So they say, we want symbiosis. We want symbiosis with you, the human species, easily the most problematic species in the history of evolution, easily the most dangerous thing that nature's come up with, but also the most hopeful thing. You know, I mean, I think the biosphere, Gaia, whatever you want to put it, has put a lot of its eggs in the basket of us, and it's either these crazy monkeys are either going to save the show or they're going to completely kick everything to pieces. You know, but times are time's getting short, and we're getting kind of desperate here. So I think that's what's going on. That's what you're seeing is, you know, and so to your question, to grow the mushroom is to initiate that symbiosis.
Right, acknowledge
you feel very much, and same with ayahuasca or any of these things. You realize what a symbiotic relationship is, you know, and but you know, you don't have to grow the mushrooms to you know, to appreciate the experience. A lot of people don't know how, they don't have time, and so on. So I don't agree that you have to do that. Ideally, you would do that because it's quite a edifying experience to, you know, it's just a fun hobby in some ways to do it and to watch this organism, you know. And mushrooms are interesting because they don't grow like plants, you know, they're not plants. They're more like animals, you know, phylogenetically, and in terms of their behavior, they're a lot like animals. You know, they grow quickly, and when the mushrooms are flushing, when you have a big crop of mushrooms and they're coming on day after day, you really do feel like you have a beast in the way that you have to tame, you have to harvest them regularly and look after them. They go through their changes quickly. Plants are much slower as a rule. So,
can I ask you about dosage? Terence used to talk about the heroic dose.
Yeah.
At some points, he would say that people that talked about psychedelics, his quote-unquote peers, had never taken any large doses, and they were all taking small doses.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing down at La Chorrera, since the supply was there, you probably had the opportunity to take large doses.
We had large doses, absolutely. We had ridiculous doses.
Thanks to you and your brother, I had my first psilocybin experience here in this loft, and thanks to Terence, the number 5 grams was in my ears, and I didn't know what to do, and I think I was on Arrowwood and checking out dosages, and when I went out to pile out what 5 grams looked like, I was terrified because it was a large quantity, and yet, you know, Terence was of thought of large doses very infrequently. Do them in your house, alone in the dark.
Total darkness,
right.
5 grams. Right.
And so I did something close to that. I couldn't get to 5. I think it was 4.2 or 3.
Yeah.
And so
close enough.
Thanks to you brothers, that we probably accelerated that with the going down there to La Chorrera, the Grower's Guide. That was all accelerated. So thank you for that. How do you feel about dosages, and what were your thoughts over the years?
Well, I think one of the things about the dose question, and one of the sort of misconceptions that people have about the mushrooms, that they're light somewhere. They're more recreational. They're easy compared to ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is the real medicine. You know, this is where you get very deep. That's a misunderstanding. But I think that because the mushrooms are easy to use recreationally, and you can take a gram and a half, go to a party, have a good time, it's all very nice, you know. And I think a lot of people do that, and more power to them. I don't think you have to plunge into the abyss every time you take a psychedelic. You can take it, you can have a good time, certainly better than drinking alcohol and all that. But they can do that a lot, and they can take those light doses, you know, pretty frequently, never suspecting that just around the corner the abyss will open up if you push it a little bit, and then it all becomes clear. There's nothing easy or less profound about mushrooms than ayahuasca. In some ways, they're even more outrageous, but I mean, the walls will melt, the creatures start coming out of the matrix, and it's heavy stuff, and it's a real shamanic transforming experience. But I think that there is this cultural sort of notion, because so many people do take just light doses, that mushrooms are for fun, and they can be used for fun. I don't think anyone would say ayahuasca is for fun, because ayahuasca's, most people's idea of fun is not throwing up, and that's something ayahuasca does. But it's a misconception. The mushrooms are just as profound and just as strong, and can produce even more profound insights, and really should be respected like ayahuasca. They should be approached with great respect. Maybe a little fear would not be out of place.
Very much so. For me, I had my ayahuasca experiences first, and so I was in a ceremony with a shaman, and there was so much respect and around it. And that's how I treat my psilocybin experiences, with the same type of, there's an occasion, it's planned, that it's dark,
right.
I'm alone, it's big, it's going to be something that's I am scared. And so that's how I've been conditioned to approach it, and I quite like it that way.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that Terence talked about, and everybody's talked about, and I talk about a lot, that the importance of set and setting. People say, how can we use these things safely and still get a lot out of it? Well, pay attention to set and setting. Those are the two big variables. Plan for it, have an intention, and and arrange your setting so that number one, you're safe, and that's assured. So maybe not on the freeway, maybe not even at a rock concert or whatever. Do it in a place where no one is going to bother you. No one, at least, that you don't want to bother you. Not the neighbors, not the local constabulary. Maybe your most significant other or something like that could be close by, or share it. But setting is important, and intention, and that's part of the whole respect thing. And why am I doing this? What do I expect to get out of it? What are we doing this for? And then the set is really everything you bring to it, who you are, what your expectation is, it's everything. It's you, it's your mindset. Everybody's mindset is different. Terence told me once when we were young, before I'd ever taken LSD, he said, don't take LSD until you've read Psychology and Alchemy by Jung, right? And we were reading Jung at that time. He said, don't take LSD. You'll get much more out of it if you do that. Well, I hadn't read Psychology and Alchemy when I took them the first time. But later I did, and I realized what he meant. I mean, a lot of the things that came up, Psychology and Alchemy is a kind of a good map for a lot of the sort of gestalts and ideas that come up during a psychedelic experience. So setting is one thing, and set is the other variable, which is much trickier, but they're both important.
Right. I find with ayahuasca, I get a distinct, finite set of lessons, like 1, 2, 3, this is what we need to go do. Sometimes it's very related to plant symbiosis. Sometimes it's related to some relationship things I need to do, very much usually those. I used to tell people, you're usually not being confronted with your IPO on an ayahuasca experience. It's very deep. But with psilocybin, sometimes I don't know any specific lessons afterwards. The day or two afterwards, I don't have in my mind that I need to go do this, this, and this. Is that something you hear a lot? Is that something that's typical? to have the kind of different experiences?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay.
I mean, ayahuasca is often much more of a counselor in some ways, or it does give you ideas about what you should be doing, or, you know, like you say, your relationships or insights into this whole, mission that we're engaged in, which is to save the planet ultimately, but that the plant-human symbiosis thing, it's much more about that. Mushrooms are not that way so much. Mushrooms, yeah, they don't really lay out an agenda. They sort of just lay down a rap, more or less. And it's like, they just download information like they did at La Chirera, and they say, well, this is what it is. This is what's going on here. And you say, well, but that's crazy. And they say, sorry, that's what it is, deal with it.
Right. Would Terrence call it having a conversation with the leprechaun, or having a conversation and you want to engage in the conversation and they're not answering your questions?
Well, they're dodgy. They're very tricky. They're elfin. They're mischievous. I mean, this is the whole thing. And this comes up again with discussions of also DMT, and mushrooms are really a form of DMT. They're really the orally active form of DMT, if you understand the chemistry, right?
Okay.
Psilocin is one molecule away from DMT. It's 4-hydroxy dimethyltryptamine. So that hydroxy group is just different enough that it's orally active without an MAO inhibitor, right? So it really is DMT. And at the higher doses you get into those areas, you see, yes, this is tryptamine land. This is the tryptamine space. And mushrooms, ayahuasca, and DMT all get you into that place, right? And I forgot what my thread was.
Yeah, I was trying to remember too. So what were we talking about? The psilocybin and the DMTs. What was I got so entranced I didn't know what we were talking about.
Yeah, but so they're all DMT of that space, but they're all like a little different. I mean, it's sort of, you're looking into the same through the same thing at the same thing, but through slightly different portals, if you will.
Yeah, this was the lessons versus the information and the download.
Right.
Okay,
It more downloads stuff, and and you can take away from any of that what you will. I mean, it can be in the form of a lesson, but usually with ayahuasca, it's, I don't know exactly. It's like you come away with a sense often that, you really have to do something. You have to change something. You have to change your diet, or, talk to your loved one and get some things straightened out, or stuff like that. And the mushroom is not necessarily, there's not a plan for action. This is the lesson for the day, or this is what you come away with, but there's not necessarily anything to do about it other than appreciate it, I guess.
Right. Did Terrence stop taking psychedelics toward the end of his life, or was he still, taking big doses?
He did. He stopped taking psychedelics, or stopped taking them regularly and at high doses for at a certain period in his life. Like the early 90s. And this was part of the crisis of his life, I think, that he was in at that time. He was having existential anxiety in a certain way, and he was beginning to question a lot of things. And I think, he was having personal issues, and he was questioning his whole career and the time wave and everything, his marriage, his public role, and all that. And I think that it was hard on him. And I mean, I used to say, and I think that's true to a certain extent, I used to say that, he stopped taking psychedelics regularly when it stopped really being about the alien and the other, and it became more about himself and looking at himself through that mirror, and that was uncomfortable, and he stepped back from it for a while. He continued to take psychedelics, but not in great quantities. And this was actually one of the things that, that was part of our, I wouldn't say conflict, but part of the thing that, when we were not seeing eye to eye during that period, I was critical of that. I was saying, well, look, you're the main spokesman for psychedelics in the world. That's how you're presenting yourself. You're not taking psychedelics. So what's going on? You need to be walking your talk if you're going to do this.
You're a tough brother to have, aren't you?
Well, I am, but I felt that true. I didn't say that. I said it out of love, I think, and concern, and he resented it. And he resented it, but I was honest, and he resented it because he knew there was some truth to it, and I did. I said those things, and he wasn't too happy about that, But then, on the other hand, maybe he had a point. I mean, he certainly had taken his share of psychedelics and at high doses, and you don't really have to apologize for somebody. I mean, Terence McKenna does not need to apologize to anybody, even his brother, about his use of psychedelics. He's been there. He understands it. We used to have. And we have an argument sometimes because Terence would say, well, he would quote Ram Dass, I think it was, or maybe it was Alan Watts, who said once, well, about psychedelics, well, once you get the message, hang up the phone, right? Terence would say that as a kind of excuse for not taking psychedelics. And that used to make me quite irritated because I would say, it's not an answering machine, it's a teacher. You have an ongoing dialogue with this thing. It's not like it's one big download. You get the message and you hang up the phone. You continue the conversation because you still have a lot to learn. That was my approach to it, and it still is. That's why I suppose I still take psychedelics. I take them all the time, and I don't feel I've learned anything. I mean, I feel I've learned stuff, but I don't feel I've learned everything there is to know. They're still teaching me. I still have them as a mentor, and that's an ongoing conversation. And so that's my approach to it. People say, "Why do you keep taking this after 40 years?" Because I'm still learning from it. Plus I also enjoy it, I mean, I learn from it, enjoy it. Say, well, I've been eating chocolate for 40 years too, and I have no intention of stopping. Why would I?
Another plant symbiosis, right?
Another plant symbiosis, right.
I think I had the author Graham Hancock in here about 3 years ago, and Graham was, always very open about, psychedelics, and he told me that in his ayahuasca ceremonies in Brazil, I believe, or Peru, that kind of after the initial 3 hours, he would be around and it's kind of in a ceremony or a kind of an exit kind of ceremony, and they would put Terence on, kind of the old lectures, and he would just listen to that. And so it's a ritual that I kind of took up and doing the same thing as well. And so now when I can't sleep at the end of an ayahuasca ceremony, I have a hard time sleeping the night. That's the hardest part for me. Is
After a session or just in general?
Well, after a session, like kind of from 3 hours to 6 hours after drinking, that's the time where you know the visions are usually over, but now you're in this time where you're trying to process, but it's not yet the next day, and that's the time when I usually allow myself to listen to a bit of Terence.
Yeah.
And it seems to help me make sense of things.
What did Graham say to you? That's what they would do, right?
Yeah.
Graham is fantastic. You know, I wish that he and Terence had gotten to know each other better. I have gotten to know him better. He and I we've been together at Wasiwasca down in Brazil, Eduardo Luna's place. We did a tour of Australia in 2012 together with Mitch Schultz. And I just saw him. He's here, and his new book came out, and he was at this private conference I was at. Okay. So I just saw him days ago. I admire that guy a lot. He's got balls. He is out there, but in a way that he's willing to say really outrageous things, but he's a good scholar, and he's not a nutcase, you know. He has support for this stuff that he's coming out with, and you know, his new book, which I'm just into a few, maybe 30 pages or so. You know about this book, right?
Yeah.
Magicians of the Gods. Yeah. It's just come out. It's blowing my mind. He's great. I like him personally. I like both he and Santa very much. We have fun hanging out. But as a scholar and as a person of courage, I have to admire Graham. You know, he's very open, and he, you know, all the psychedelic stuff he's open about. He's open about his personal experiences with those things. And in terms of the ideas he's promulgating through Magicians of the Gods, you know, which is the sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods. Well, now there's a whole lot more data that is available that shows that what he asserted in Fingerprints of the Gods is essentially correct, you know. And now there's more data, and his new book, you know, is bringing that out. And you know, the guy is fearless, you know, to say it. But he's not just asserting crazy stuff. There's reason to believe, based on what he's bringing out, that he was correct, and you know, that actually there was a complex, relatively complex, not you know, levitation technology or anything like that, but a sophisticated world traveling, you know, maritime situation back 22 to 24,000 years ago, and you know, and they spread all over the world. And these megalithic sites that we're familiar with are actually recent, fairly recent to what was there. And some of the oldest one, like this one in Turkey that everyone agrees is at least 11,600 years old, Göbekli Tepe, is the most recent instantiation of a much older civilization. And there's no reason why that can't be, you know. I mean, it's and there's evidence that in fact it was so, and there was a global cataclysm around 11,000, well, between 12,800 years ago and 11,600 years ago, that just devastated the world. And there were floods and volcanoes and earthquakes and all of this stuff that shows up in the myths of these cultures. Every culture has a myth about a big flood and about volcanism and earthquakes and a period of time when things were pretty wild and woolly and difficult on the planet. And it turns out that it has to do with this cometary encounter that took place in what the geologists called the Younger Dryas. There was a fairly big comet that came through, and it either closely grazed the Earth or it actually, pieces of it impacted the Earth. This is not controversial in geology. You know, the geologists are now accepting this and saying there's plenty of evidence this took place. The archaeologists don't know what to say. I mean, they're just, no,
Yeah.
you know, we're in denial. We don't want to hear any of this. This is,
Yeah, they've never known what to say with a lot of Graham's assertions.
and archaeology is not a science. You know, unfortunately, this is what comes out. It's not a science because they ignore evidence.
Yeah, we were super fortunate to have Graham on the show very early. I think it was 3 years ago. And it was actually on his first London Real appearance that he was really open about his experiences with marijuana and how he had smoked for so many years and had stopped after an ayahuasca ceremony. And how it had really, the plant ally, ayahuasca, had taught him something about his other ally, and it was time to take a break. And
Yeah.
really open about it. And in the beginning of one of his books, he talks about his Iboga experience and trying to reconnect with his father that had died. And, you know, Graham has that credibility of a scholar, but most scholars aren't willing to talk about their psychedelic experiences because, you know, they get ostracized.
They're not. But he's honest that way.
He's very honest.
He's
and
courageous.
then he writes his fictional books to go in with his knowledge of ayahuasca, and the ones in Mexico. They're fantastic. And Graham's a huge asset for us in the UK. Probably one of the best proponents of.
Well, I hope you have him on the show.
Oh yeah, we've had him on twice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Since his book has come out?
No, but I almost interviewed him on stage for Magicians of the Gods, but we had a scheduling conflict, so I was going to do something.
Get him on the show.
Yeah, we'll get him back. Well, I'm sure Graham's listening to this, so we'll have to get him back.
Get him on this show. Absolutely. He's coming to the States too to promote his book. It won't even be out in the States until mid-November, but he's coming. And you know, usually it's a West Coast, East Coast thing. I live in flyover land in Minnesota, but I'm gonna arrange at least 2 gigs for him, just because I admire his work so much, and I can do it. You know, I think a lot of people will come out to hear him. Yeah, another pioneer, a very courageous man indeed.
Yeah, very much so. Can I ask you about your success and how over the years you managed to publish books like this and still be so relevant and be such a figurehead for this movement? Were there any things that you changed about your routines or the way that you conducted your life that had a big change in how you were able to be successful?
These success secrets are only available on the London Real Academy. Become a member and get access to live shows, exclusive courses, my webinars, bonus content, meetups, live events, an amazing community, and much, much more. Now back to the rest of the show.
Do you think this ayahuasca resurgence is correlated with our need to embrace the plants?
It's totally correlated with. That's exactly what is happening.
I think the plants engineered this episode so more people could talk about this.
Well, the plant, yeah, you can be sure they engineered this episode as well as everything else. But yes, I think that's exactly what's happening.
Right.
I mean, people say, well, plants, don't think, don't act like that. You're projecting all this anthropomorphic qualities onto the plants, and imagining that. But in fact, true, I'm using all these metaphors, which are kind of inaccurate. But in fact, we are learning now that plants are intelligent and they do behave and they do all those things. They plan and they're pretty clever and they don't have brains as we understand it, but they do have intelligence. And a few years ago, to talk about plant intelligence, then people say, well, this guy is really woo-woo. Actually, not so much, not so much. There is now, Michael Pollan, among other people, have written about that. He has a wonderful article, which I urge you to Google and read. It's called The Intelligent Plant, and talking about a lot of this stuff that's coming out about plant behavior, strategizing, planning for the future, forming alliances with us and other plants, and behavior, really, that is hard to characterize any other way than intelligent behavior. But it works on a different time scale than we do. So it, it's like, when I was a graduate student, when I started my graduate work at UBC in 1980, went there to study, initially psilocybin, but in the botany department, which I was in, there were maybe 40 graduate students, and there were, like, in the zoology department, there was maybe a couple hundred graduate students in the zoology department. I said, so why so many graduate students in zoology? What's wrong with botany? And they said, well, plants don't do anything. They just kind of sit there. Well, they do sit there, but they do a lot. And that's the thing. The plants, they mediate their environment. They mediate their relationship with the environment through chemistry and all. That's why plants are such great chemists, and that's what these things are. I mean, from psychedelics to everything else, these secondary compounds, these are messenger molecules, and they regulate plants' relationship with the whole ecosystem, essentially by chemistry. There was a famous botanist who said plants substitute biosynthesis for behavior. We react to the environment through running away or staying and fighting or doing all those behavioral responses. Plants do it through chemistry because they're stuck in one place. But it's no less complex than our responses.
Super important message. Dennis, I always ask everyone here a couple questions at the end. I'm going to ask you, and it's very, very poignant with you. If you could make a call to the 20-year-old Dennis McKenna and give that young man a bit of advice, what would you tell him? That happens to coincide with you being it.
If I could speak to my younger self?
Yes, what would you tell him?
Don't do what I did. No, I'd probably say spend more time, getting your academic chops together. Spend more time building your foundation, if you're going to work in this area. Get a degree in medicinal chemistry or pharmacology or something really specialized, maybe an MD even. And that will give you more credibility, and that will open doors to you that I don't have. I might say that.
Okay.
But then on the other hand, I would say beware of, keep your own personal accounts. Beware that this is a trap in some way, because you get so deeply into medicine or some of these things.
You get institutionalized to a certain
And the
extent.
idea is to take any curiosity that you might have away and to kind of numb you and make you a part of the cog of the machine. And I've never been a cog in the machine. So it's a fine line,
On that same note, what's the best advice you've ever received in your life, business, personal, academic? Would it have come from Terence or not? Did he ever give you advice? Sounds like you were giving him a lot of advice.
I gave him advice.
Constructive criticism.
Yeah. Well, I've had good pieces of advice from Terence and other people. I think one thing I took to heart what he told me, which is true, which is worth keeping in mind, is that everything passes. Everything passes. So you can't hang on to it. I think this came up when when we were down together in Iquitos in 1981 when I was doing my graduate work, and Terence came down and joined me for part of that time. And at that time, I had left a girlfriend back in Vancouver. Regretted leaving her, but I had to go, right? And she was back there, and she wrote me and said, just can't be separate from you. I take it up with this other guy, and I was quite shattered by that. I was quite depressed by that. And I shared that with Terence, and I got that letter in Iquitos, and he said, well, everything passes, And I thought that was good advice. As it turned out, I went back to Vancouver, and that woman is my wife now, so it was a good outcome. But I kept that in mind. Everything passes, and then the other piece of advice is, don't believe anything anyone tells you. Just trust yourself, and keep an open mind about things, but don't be so open-minded that you completely abandon your critical faculties. I mean, I think it was Whitehead that said, and that Terence and I both took to heart, the essence of the scientific attitude is the suspended judgment, and it's okay to say, we don't know. It's okay to say that the picture is incomplete, because the picture will always be incomplete. So, that's the beauty of science in a way. You never prove anything in science. You only say that you can't disprove something. And, as far as we know, given the data that we have, a thing, a phenomenon, whatever, is this way. But there's always the chance that new data will come on that will totally overturn that. So that's a beautiful thing about science, And that's a personal thing too. Be skeptical. Arthur C. Clarke said, I guess it was Carl Sagan who said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I think that's true too. I think, when these reports come of things on Mars or UFOs or all this stuff, okay, what's the evidence? And is that you're making an extraordinary claim, so you better have extraordinary evidence to back it up. And ordinary claims require evidence too. Evidence is a good thing. I tend to rail against faith a lot. Faith in my book is, faith is believing something for which you have no evidence, for which somebody says you should believe this because you should believe this, because we tell you to believe this. Why should I believe it? And I don't care that you tell me. If there's no evidence for it, I'm not sure I want to buy into it. And this is, of course, the whole religious thing, right? And that's another thing that's beautiful about psychedelics. You don't have to have faith to take psychedelics. You do not have to have faith. All you have to do is have the courage to sit down and drink the cup or smoke the pipe or whatever it is, and evaluate for yourself what it means. You don't have to accept anyone's interpretation of it, unlike religion, where they're very invested in getting you to accept their interpretation of it. And so that to me is, that is repulsive to me. I want to run away from that. It's like psychedelics are the cure for faith in a certain way, or you come by. You know what I'm saying? Faith informs you of nothing. It's just a set of propositions that you're supposed to accept without any question. Well, the essence of science is to ask questions, and so that's an approach I try to take, and accept those things, and just approach everything with an open mind, but not so open that I'm ready to believe any damn thing anybody wants to tell me.
Last question. If Terence were to walk in here and sit down here in this chair and you had 5 minutes with him, what would you tell him?
What would I tell him? Well, gosh, I don't know. I would tell him that, I would tell him that I wish he'd stuck around, to help with this project, with this whatever it is we're doing, because I feel lonely sometimes. I do feel lonely. I feel like I'm just soldiering on, and it's not a voluntary thing. I wish that he was still, still there. But then I look at the cultural phenomenon of his presence on the net and all that, and I were like, well, he never really went away. He's still influential, but I wish he was here, and I wish we could still interact in real time and hash out some of these ideas that we've both been preoccupied with, and maybe reconcile some of our differences, and just in good discussions, because he was always up for a good argument, always up for a good conversation. And I miss that a lot, Not that I don't hang out with brilliant people, but he just brought something that there'll just never be another like him, They broke the mold when they made him. So, I guess that's what I'd say.
I think you summarized it right there. I just don't think there will be another one like him. And
there will never be another one
which
like
him. And that's, that in itself is an unscientific thing to say, because, statistically there should be. But every time I listen to him, I think there's just not going to be another one like him.
Not another one like him.
And,
And I'm certainly not like him, nor am I trying to be. I would never try to be. I have my own ideas, and we shared a lot of ideas, but I'm not the successor to Terence McKenna, and people in this area, this realm of discussion. I think some imagine that they're the precursor, or they're the successor to Terence McKenna, but I think they're quite deluded.
Yeah, I don't know how they could even aspire to that.
Yeah.
And I know you're not trying to be him in the book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. It's beautifully written. It's a fantastic story, and I'm so glad you told it, because you could have easily not, and gone on with all the other work that you're doing. And so it's a treasure that you've done this. And I just want to say, I've had the pleasure of being able to speak to hundreds of people over the last 4 years, and I think it's probably fair enough to say that you and Terence had probably the most direct material effect on my life than anyone I've sat down with. Because for me, the psychedelic experience is something that I only experienced in the last 10% of my life. And before that, I marginalized it, like so many people do in this world, as something that those people do, or something that those other people do, or those crazy people do, or those hippie people do.
Right.
And for me, it was just never something I considered. And by starting to broadcast and starting to talk to people, for some reason, I was drawn towards ayahuasca. And you know what it's like when you're drawn towards it, you hear it everywhere, and you start noticing and people talking about it. And it was actually on the Joe Rogan Experience, one of his guests, Aubrey Marcus, he first spoke about it, and it was 18 months it took me until I finally had my first ceremony. And that changed my life. And listening to Terence, and experience with psilocybin mushrooms and DMT, which I think probably all would have happened maybe 30, 40 years later if it wasn't for the two of you. And so I just want to say thank you very much. It's had such a huge effect on my life and the way I interact with society, and I think the way I treat...
So many people say this, you know, so thank you for saying that. That, it's like, that's an affirmation that it's not a waste of time, that it's touching people, and you're obviously an influential person, you're a voice for the culture, and you're having an impact. So thank you for that, and don't thank me, thank the plants. I mean, this is all part of the plan.
It is, and if you had told me 5 years ago I would have been talking about plant consciousness, I would have said the same thing that you said earlier. They don't move, they don't have an intelligence, but as I look at my actions, then the plants are making me do things and talk about things and open up conversations that are having a direct impact on those said plants. So.
Symbiosis.
Symbiosis, right.
Right,
yeah.
right.
Dennis, it's
Thank you so much.
It's a real
been
honor.
pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me. I know you took time. You're the busiest man in London right now, going to so many different conferences. So many people want your time and want to listen to you. So thanks so much for this time. I think we got such a great snapshot of who you are and in the past, and I think people are just going to love this. So
great.
It's been a
Thank
real
you
honor.
for inviting me. I'm glad we pulled this together. Look forward to the next time.
Yeah, please come see us again in London.
Well, I certainly will.
All right. We say it's about the journey on London Real, so I wish you well in yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All
Thank you. All the best.
Okay.
All the best to you, sir.
When it comes to London Real, it doesn't get more powerful than Graham Hancock.
Do we, as adults, have the right to make decisions about what we put in our own bodies and what we experience with our own consciousness? Or must we seek permission from the state?
Now he's back, armed with War God.
Cut the hearts out of those who they captured in battle. I mean, literally, human sacrifice.
But former Goldman Sachs trader Patrick Vickers isn't convinced.
And our own consciousness.
But there's stuff that falls slightly in the grey there.
Not really.
Well, what about healthcare?
And they go head to head.
Should we then withdraw healthcare?
It's an incredibly difficult.
Since we don't do that for all of those other things.
Absolutely, a line has to be drawn at some level.
This Sunday, London Real presents The Return of Graham Hancock.